Today I'm going to be drawing on an A4 piece of paper, and I'm going to be studying cow intestines. This is because as part of my collaboration with Petra Goetz, we are doing a lot of agricultural imagery and themes, and what I'm going to do is a cow's stomach and intestines. I'm going to be drawing that with these two fine liners. This is a 1.0 and a 0.1 nib. So okay, let's get started. It was a little weird for me to draw an ink first drawing and have a reference. I really don't do that very often. I've been doing it more for this project, which is part of the Movement in the Field project, than for anything else. I normally draw ink first from imagination, and I don't even do as much of that as I used to, but it was the type of thing that I like to draw from imagination anyway. It was similar shapes to those, so it was something which I was kind of half comfortable with. Although there was that trepidation of, should I do an underdrawing in pencil before I start to go in with ink? I'm glad that I didn't. I think that some of the marks are quite interesting, and I really do think that the pens lend themselves to this type of interpretation. Now, I like these shapes. You know, you've got some rounded shapes, some very wispy kind of vein-like shapes as well. And getting those different textures and angles was part of an enjoyment, which I think I'm going to try to remember and lend to my drawings from imagination, my mutation type of sketches, if you will. That's the drawing series that I feel this relates closest to. I may do more of these drawings for this project, but for now it feels as though it will be a one-off piece, and I will do more imagination drawings or freestyle drawings, which I find is my comfort zone. Lately I've been doing plein air painting and a bit of urban sketching, so I am trying to broaden my knowledge and practice a lot more and improve on my knowledge and skill set. And this is closer to my comfort zone than either of those things, really. Even though for urban sketching I've been doing ink first drawings for that as well. Now, I did enjoy this part, this wispy line part on the right. I found that to be something which I'd like to continue into my drawings from imagination. I think it was the fact that it doesn't feel as though you can go wrong. Now, this is kind of an amalgam of three different references. I decided to put together different elements that I thought were the most interesting and use those to create a composition. And one of the reference photos is those sausage-like shapes running down the center. And there's a very small amount of those in another reference. So I thought if I just capitalize on the reference of that kind of intestine, like kind of swirling for a diagonal center, then I can push everything else to each side. So it's not going to be accurate to what the reference is actually showing. In case I haven't mentioned it, I think I did mention on the intro, this is a cow's stomach, or at least loosely based on reference images of a cow's stomach. And the intention is to get it to a certain stage, similar to my mutation drawings, to get it to a kind of stage in the ink process, which is quite a nice finish with a bit of depth and line variation, and then to take it onto the computer and finish it off there, but a little bit differently than what I do with the mutation drawings, just because on the mutation I only do flat colors, and with this I feel as though I may try to do slightly more light and shadow, but I'll see how that goes. Now, all of this is very abstract. I don't realize it at the time, but it is really making little dashes and marks and shadow shapes in the void of white. And that's not a bad thing. I quite like, abstraction and how much internal organs can be just strange alien-like shapes and just textures built up out of nowhere. It gives me a lot of ideas for my own drawing and how to create a kind of landscape of, I suppose, just kind of biological matter. It's a little bit gross sounding, but I think it's quite fascinating textures. It's almost to me like doing drapery. You have to consider several different surfaces and whether they are wet and shiny or whether they are more matte and kind of textured, than something which is kind of got a gloss on it because it's got a sheen of moisture. Others don't. And then there's kind of the veins which you have to consider and different folds and bends. Things like that are all great studies to me for understanding form. And then the challenge is going to be the digital side because I really don't do that very often. Now I've got it up to this stage here and I only used the 0.1 nib. I think it's looking quite interesting already. So what I'm going to do now is put this onto the computer and start to colour it all up digitally and see how it turns out. Now this process was harder than I was hoping it would be, partly because I'm using Affinity Photo to do this process and I'm really not that familiar with this software. So it took a long time for me to figure out where I was going wrong with certain things, and it didn't take a long time. It's just it took a lot of time out of the process, and it was things like using the color dropper, and I realized that I've got a set of layers, and one is the line work that you'll see in the black and white section, and there are 3 photo references that I'm trying to use to select the colors so that I have something based on what the reference is offering. And if that layer for the reference is selected when I use the dropper, then it kind of almost bleeds into the whole photo, and not like a paint bucket, but like a tint for everything in the image, which I just didn't understand how to avoid until quite late on in this process, where I realized if I how do you say it? I suppose if I didn't select the layer, but I did make sure it was visible for me to select color from, that was a way where selecting the color from the reference became, I don't know how to say it, became safe for me to use without it affecting the whole layer. It's a very strange way to explain it, but the color wouldn't bleed into the reference photo. It would just be something which I was able to grab so long as that layer wasn't selected. It's strange, but that's how I did it. And I had another problem with half opacity layers, which I hadn't realized, where I assumed I assumed that certain layers were, just opaque colors, just solid colors. Whereas when I tried to put a layer of color on top, it would treat it almost like watercolor, where it starts to become darker. It was odd. Now, if you can hear noise in the background, I apologize. There's a bit of work going on in the house at the moment. I usually don't record around this time, but it's important to me to get this video made and posted soon. So it's just pushed it a little bit into the later schedule. So forgive me for that. But yeah, and part of this process was difficult as well, because colouring up this section was really strange because it's an unusual texture. I wasn't exactly sure what I was trying to achieve, and the colours that I'm using are fairly tonally equivalent. Like there wasn't much contrast between them in order to suggest a sort of substance, or light. So it was a bit too flat, and I wanted to try and make it pop a little bit better. So that was something which was a bit of a consideration at the time was I need to use something else. And I selected another color that just was the same problem. It just wasn't light enough to have the desired effect. So for this part of the drawing here, this was the desired effect, was to have something which is a lot brighter and to suggest the shine on it, but to keep it flat. And again, with the intestines, a lot brighter color. And at first it felt wrong and it looks a little bit sloppy the way that you can see me applying it, but it has the desired effect. I wanted it to look like it was the shine and it was a moisture on the kind of substance, and that's what I achieved with this, I think, anyway. And you can see obviously the reference doesn't look like this, but I want to have something which is not trying to look photographic. It was trying to look more of like a graphic illustration, and I quite enjoy, this kind of process of turning something which is a bit of a gross reference image into a more comic book looking style. Now this part here was tricky because I had a brush that was a specific width, and then I thought, well, I can go back in with the eraser because it's on its own layer and start to create these shapes. But it was quite time consuming, and I was trying to change the width of the brush, so you can see lots of small wispy lines there, which I was really trying to push as quickly as I could to get vein looking blood-like shapes, and then avoid it looking like flames. And it does kind of look like flames, but I thought hopefully when it's all put together it will just look like part of the substance. And I could be wrong, but I feel as though that's worked. But it is a fine line between veins and flames when it comes to these types of colors. Perhaps that's something which I just need to learn better. But and then I went in with the shadow on this strange vomitous looking substance here. It almost looks like mincemeat or something. So I don't know what part of the intestines this is. Not the intestines, sorry, internal organs this is. But it's all a bit gross, and I wasn't sure whether this little peppering of dark shadow would work. It's all very pixelated up close, so it's not an image that's been made to be printed out or exhibited, but I may try a print of it, I'm not sure. But it was just something which I thought if I can get it to a certain level, then hopefully zoomed out, it will have the desired effect. And I feel as though this made all the difference, because as much as it's a small amount of these all over the place, it's such a high contrast between the colours that are there already and the one that I'm applying, that you have this change in the kind of tone and texture. I resized the whole image because there was an edge which I didn't really like, so I wanted to cut that off and make sure that the drawing went right to the edge of the image. And then from this point on, it was just steamrolling through everything, so it was creating colours that had a huge amount of contrast. And I put down a background colour so that I could then introduce a kind of, a contrasting colour to suggest tone again. And that's where I started to push through. And this bottom section with the deep red worked quite well. Now this part with the purple on top of the brown I was a bit nervous about, but as soon as I cut it back with the eraser tool again, it started to take shape, and I thought, it's odd looking isolated, but with everything else, as soon as everything's finished, it will hopefully sit in the piece quite comfortably. And I feel as though that's what happened. Now this here was tricky, trying to get a colour that I was happy with for these bits of, again, intestine looking things popping out through the mincemeat, and then I have some on top which I coloured differently. And I wasn't sure at first, but I did end up going for the strong red because I just thought it was a good decision in order to make it look quite interesting and quite visceral, meat-like. So as much as the colours were taken with a dropper from the reference, it ends up looking very different, and it's because of the graphic nature of this image that I'm pushing, and I'm happy with that style. Again, it's not something which I was trying to do any differently. Now I quite like this yellow at the top, and part of me thought maybe I should keep it like that, but I did have my heart set on having different tones and different colours pushed throughout, so I did the effect on certain textures and then honoured the rest by pushing forward with a colour dropper and finding some deep pinks and getting some gross looking, you know, sort of mass behind all of this shape at the front, because something has to sit behind it and it has to be meat-like and glossy, and that was again just trying to get little touches of bits of light here and there to suggest something. And then these grey and blue section here, I think this kind of leads to it because it's almost a purpley grey, and then with the blue it just looks like what you imagine from internal organs. It's a bit gross, but because I've put it on flat, I think it serves the image quite well. And you know, you've got this combination of strong colours, all suggesting meat and offal type of substances, which I think work. Again, this grey and this deep blue, I think work quite nicely, and browns again. So I just pushed forward to get all of these doing the job and working towards that that suggestion. And it became a lot easier towards the end, which is typical. So that was the comfiest part, is finishing it off right at the end. And then I tried to add noise, you know, so you'll see here that I'm pushing certain noise into the image and seeing if it works, and it really didn't work. So I thought I'm just going to leave it as it is. I think it's quite nice without it, and that's what I ended up with. Okay, so that is the image done. Now, I think there's some interesting parts of this. I tried to use a few tones for each of the textures of the different organs. I thought, because I normally do flat colours and use a bit of noise, I thought this time what I'll do is I'll use some light and some shadow on each of the elements of the cow intestines and stomach. And I thought that made it quite interesting, a little bit gross, but that was part of the point of the project. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.